All right, so I want to make sure before we move on this week that you have watched the video about perfect passive participles. It's important to do that because they're related to an ablative absolute, so you need to understand what they are first. Okay, something called an ablative absolute is frequently found in Latin literature, and the word absolute comes from the Latin verb absolvere, to free, loosen, separate, or detach. And think about how we use its derivatives in English. When someone is absolved from a crime, it means they are freed from the blame for that crime. So this simply means that the ablative absolute can be separated from the rest of the sentence, and the sentence will still make complete sense. It is connected but not essential to the meaning of the sentence. Frequently, it's even set off by commas, and you'll see that in Latin too when we write Latin sentences for you. We'll do that as well. And in Latin, it's always the combination of a noun in the obligative case and a participle. So let's take a look at the rules. First one is the noun or the pronoun in the absolute is never the subject of the sentence. And it shows a time or cause relationship with the rest of the sentence. And it's made up of a participle and a noun. And in Latin, both of these are in the ablative case. Remember, we don't have ablative cases in English. So here's some examples in English. The first one is the sun rising, we set out on our journey. I'm already bolded the ablative absolute phrase for you, so it makes it easy to identify. Now, we is the subject of the sentence. So if you look, we set out on our journey. We is the subject of the sentence. The subject of the ablative absolute phrase is sun. So if you remember, they cannot be the same subject, and here they are not. Okay, so the participle rising, it's easy to recognize because it's an ing. The participle rising modifies the word sun, because remember it's a verbal adjective, so it has to modify a noun. Remember, it matches it in gender, case, and number. The adjective questions are which one, what kind, and how many. So this one answers which one. Which sun? It's the rising sun. So the participial phrase, which is the whole thing, the sun rising, shows a time relationship to the rest of the sentence. It says the rest of the sentence is we set out on our journey. It tells the when of when we set out. Do you remember? Because it was ablative absolute, shows a time or cause relationship. All right, let's look at the next one. With the veil covering her face, no one could see her identity. So I've already marked the ablative absolute for you in bold here, veil covering. What's the subject of the main part of the clause of the sentence? No one. Okay. And what is the subject of the ablative absolute? Veil. So they are different, so that follows our rule. All right. The participle covering, remember it's a verbal adjective. What does it modify? It modifies veil. What kind of veil? A covering kind, right? A covering veil. And this is the whole participial phrase, with the veil covering her face. It shows a cause relationship with the rest of the sentence. No one could see her identity. Why? Because there was a veil covering it, right? No one could see her identity. Now let's look at the last one here. Although the baby was kidnapped, Eloise was brave. So here's a longer, although the baby had been kidnapped. I did mark that one for you. Eloise is the subject of the sentence. Eloise was brave. That's the main clause. That's the sentence. She's the subject. What is the subject of the ablative absolute? It's the baby. They are two separate things. Okay? The participle had been kidnapped, right here. What does it modify? It modifies baby. Which baby? The kidnapped one. And then this is the whole participial phrase. Although the baby had been kidnapped. It shows a cause relationship with the rest of the sentence. The rest of the sentence is Eloise was brave. Why was Eloise brave? Because she needed to be, because the baby had been kidnapped. All right, so let's add one more rule and look at the rules specifically for an ablative absolute in Latin. Okay, we've already got the noun and the pronoun in the ablative absolute is this. The noun or the pronoun is never the subject of the sentence. It shows a time or cause relationship, and it is a noun or a pronoun and a participle, both in the ablative case, okay, and agreeing in gender number, right? And literally translated, the ablative absolute is with. You start with a with, and then you do the noun and the participle. All right, so let's talk about an ablative absolute with a present active participle. This is the one you learned last week. So when the ablative absolute appears with a present active participle, often the best literal translation uses with or if or as. So with the noun verbing. And I will tell you that all of this is in your chart book. It's on page 19. So when you go back, you can actually pull it out and make notes on there if you want to, or you can follow along. And the ablative in the singular, so we need to remember that. The ablative in the singular uses the E ending, not the I ending. All right, let's do an example. I'll go through this with you here. Okay. Leone avenente femina discessit. I'm going to give you the whole translation right now so that you can see how it matches. So I've marked the ablative absolute phrase for you already so you can take a look at it. We'll do that at first, but not a little later. With the lion approaching, the woman left. So the woman is clearly the subject of the main part of the sentence, not the lion. Right? They are separate. It's the subject of the ablative absolute. Well, it's subject of the ablative absolute. So you can clearly see it in Latin because leone is in the ablative masculine singular. Using an E for the singular fits the rules. Remember the rule right here? Ad veniente is also in the ablative singular masculine form. Remember, they have to match because the participle approaching modifies lion. And it answers the question, which lion? The approaching one. And the participial phrase, with the lion approaching, shows a cause relationship with the rest of the sentence. The participial phrase tells us the cause of why the woman left. You could also say, since the lion is approaching. Remember, there's times that we can translate using other words or turning it into a different kind of clause. Those are all listed in your chart book, right? You could also say, since the lion is approaching, the woman left. The translation must clearly show that the action of the participle is still going on at the same time as the action of the main verb, no matter what tense the main verb is in. And this is the main verb. Okay, left is the main verb. So the lion is approaching and the woman is leaving concurrently, which means at the same time. You could not translate the sentence as when she was departing. You can't use when. You can't say when she was departing, the woman saw the lion, because the subject of each clause, she and woman, would be the same. So if I said, when she is departing, the woman saw the lion. Because if you look, she is the subject of the ablative, the absolute, and woman. So it actually would not be, they're the same thing. So it actually would not be an ablative absolute. Remember, the noun or the pronoun of the ablative absolute cannot be the same subject as the main clause of the sentence. All right, one more example. Okay, I'm going to change colors here to separate them out. All right. Duque milites volcantne hostes fugerunt. So first of all, what we're going to do is identify the main clause. The main clause is hostes fugerunt. The enemy fled. So here we've got something, something, comma, the enemy fled. That's easy. Is fugerunt is simple indicative, which is just third perfect plural. Okay, so there's not a participle ever in the main clause. Now notice the first clause, and it's separated off by commas. Duque and volcante are an ablative. You can already see that because of the E. That's an easy one. So they are ablative. And since duque is a noun and volcante, see the NT? Do you notice the NT here? Notice the NT. That should give you the clue that it is a participle. Since it's a participle and both have ablative endings, we can identify it as an ablative absolute. So there's part of the ablative absolute, and there's the other part of the ablative absolute. So duque is the subject of the first. So here we go. Subject. And a subject of the first clause. And hostes is the subject of the second clause, which fits our rule that the noun or the pronoun of the ablative absolute cannot be the same subject as the main clause of the sentence. So the participle calling, so we have with the leader, we're going to translate it with noun participle, with the leader calling the soldiers. You could also say with the general calling his soldiers, the enemy fled. So the participle calling, volcantne, modifies leader. Remember, verbal adjective. It answers the question, which leader? Well, the calling one. The participial phrase, with leader calling, shows a cause relationship with the rest of the sentence. The participial phrase tells the cause of why the enemy fled. Now notice that there is an accusative, milites. You see that? There's an accusative in the sentence, in the first clause. Remember that a participle is a verbal adjective, and because it started out as a verb, it retains its ability to have a direct object or accusative. So with the leader calling the soldiers, the enemy fled. You could also say, since the leader is calling his soldiers or the soldiers. The translation must clearly show that the action of the participle is still going on at the same time as the action of the main verb, no matter what tense the main verb is in. The leader is calling and the enemy is fleeing concurrently. Okay? So it needs to have, so as far as present active participle, the events need to be going on at the same time as the main verb. And there we go. That's an important one to remember. So the action has to happen the same time as the main verb. Okay? The leader is calling and the enemy is fleeing concurrently. All right, so let's talk about perfect passive participle. So here's the difference in time. So often the literal translation is with noun participle. Or you could say with the noun having been verbed. And so when the main verb is in past tense, you translate the ablative absolute as had been verbed. When the main verb is in present or future tense, you translate the ablative absolute as has been verbed. Okay, that one is in your chart book. You just have to pay attention. And any translation must clearly indicate that the action of the participle has finished before the action of the main verb. Do you remember the present passive was it had to be going on at the same time? You can think of that as presently. Presently it's going on. right? Perfect, we know that the action finished in the past. Same is true of an ablative absolute with one. The action of the participle is finished before, so it's done by the time the main verb comes along. All right, let's take a look at this first one here. Roma, Wisa, Weary, Gaudi, Bont. I've already given this to you in the first one to help you. Here's the ablative absolute. Can you see that they're both in the ablative form? Roma, Wisa, with Rome, having been seen, the men rejoiced. So you can also say after Rome was seen, the men rejoiced, or because Rome was seen, the men rejoiced. Both are appropriate because the adverbs when, since, although, because, if, as, after are frequently used when to introduce an ablative absolute with a perfect passive participle, depending on the context of the sentence in the surrounding passage. So as a reminder, participles sound weird to our English ear. It's perfectly acceptable to translate the above as when Rome was, or when Rome had been seen, the men rejoiced. So remember, imperfect is now kind of interchangeable with perfect. That's why we can say was. So when Rome had been seen, or when Rome was seen, that's probably the more likely one. The men rejoiced. But the action finished before the action of the main verb. It was seen first. They finished seeing it. It was done. They saw it. Then the men rejoiced. All right, let's look at another example. Urbe capta spem tamen habibam. All right, so here's our ablative absolute. And remember, before they were in E, this one, because of, you still have to do the right ablative form for whatever declensions it is in. Okay, so let's take a look. I'm going to turn it back to black here to write. So, although, we'll start with although, right? We can choose, that's one of the ones that we can choose. Although urbe, the city, it is the subject of the ablative absolute, capta, had been captured. Where's the main part of the sentence, right? Main part of the sentence is right here. It's set off by a comma. There's no ablatives in it. There could be, but there's no, it has a normal indicative verb. That's how we know it's the main part of the sentence. Although the city had been captured, habibam, Tamen, still had hope. Okay, so the main verb is in past tense here, so I use had for translating the participle. Remember? The main verb is in past tense, so I use had. I still had hope, right? So it had been captured. That happened in the past. It was completed. So I need to show that the participle is finished before the action of the main verb. Although the city had been captured, that happened first. Then it completed, and then I still had hope. That was going on afterwards. Okay. Last one. Urbe capta rex discessit. So let's take a look at that translation. We see both of these in ablative. That's a clue. We see that this verb right here is in the indicative discessit, so we know that that's the main part. Rex is the subject here, different than city, which is the subject here, so that follows our rules. Capta, remember? Captured, we got that from the last one. Which kind of city? Or which one? The captured one, right? So if I wanted to translate that, I would say, let's try with. We can literally do a with. With the city having been captured, the king left. Okay, that's a literal translation. So we're going to look at some translations. Any of these will work. Any of these following translations make sense because they keep the action of the participle being finished. Remember, this is finished. And then this happens. Then the king leaves. So the king leaves afterwards, right? All right. So although he captured the city, the king left. When he captured the city, the king left. Since he captured the city, the king left. Having captured the city, the king left. After he captured the city, the king left. Because he captured the city, the king left. Those are all in your chart book. All of those work because they keep the action of the participle finishing before the action of the main verb, which is leaving. All right. In order to determine the best translation of an ablative absolute, you must look to the context within the sentence or the passage. And if I give you a single sentence and you're not sure, then that just means you have lots of choices because you don't know what the context is. And that is ablative absolute.